In the first impeachment hearing of the day this morning, the Republican complaint about hearsay finally disappeared.
Ms. Williams, you heard the call with your own ears, right?
Yes, sir.
Not secondhand, not hearsay. You heard the president speak. You heard his voice on the call.
Correct.
And your conclusion was what he said about investigating the Bidens was, your words, unusual and inappropriate, I believe. Am I right?
That was my testimony.
You heard it with your own ears.
Correct.
Not secondhand, not from somebody else, not hearsay, right?
Correct.
You heard the president's voice on the call.
I did.
And you heard him raise that subject again that Ambassador Sondland had raised before about investigating the Bidens, right?
I did.
And I want to ask you, when you heard him say that, what was the first thought that went through your mind?
Frankly, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was probably an element of shock that maybe in certain regards my worst fear of how our Ukraine policy could play out was playing out, and how this was likely to have significant implications for U.S. national security.
And you went immediately and you reported it, didn't you?
I did.
Why?
Because that was my duty.
Because that was my duty. That was Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney. He will join us in just a moment. The first two witnesses of the day were Jennifer Williams, a career Foreign Service officer in the State Department, who is currently detailed to the staff of Vice President Mike Pence, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who is currently detailed to the staff of the White House National Security Council. They both listened to President Trump's phone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine, in which President Trump asked President Zelensky to do him a favor, the favor of investigating Joe Biden. In other words, a favor for the president's reelection campaign. In this afternoon's hearing, a longtime Republican congressional staffer, Tim Morrison, who served in the Trump White House as the senior director for European affairs at the National Security Council, explained what was at stake for Ukraine in the president's request for an investigation of Joe Biden.
I mean, it was President Zelensky left the room, Vice President Pence left the room, and in sort of an ante-room, Ambassador Sondland and Presidential Advisor Yermak had this discussion. Yes.
And what did Ambassador Sondland say to tell you that he told Mr. Yermak?
That the Ukrainians would have to have the Prosecutor General make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted.
In that testimony, Tim Morrison delivered the essence of what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is now calling the bribery case against Donald Trump. Donald Trump was trying to pay a bribe to the president of Ukraine so that the president of Ukraine would publicly announce an investigation of Joe Biden. And because this is Donald Trump we're talking about, he was using other people's money for his bribe. He was using $400 million of American taxpayer money authorized by Congress. Today's testimony established that Donald Trump was not going to hand over that money to Ukraine without getting something back for himself. The former special envoy to Ukraine, Ambassador Kurt Volker, testified that the investigation Donald Trump was asking for, the investigation of Joe Biden, was ludicrous.
Mayor Giuliani raised, and I rejected, the conspiracy theory that Vice President Biden would have been influenced in his duties as vice president by money paid to his son. As I previously testified, I have known Vice President Biden for 24 years. He is an honorable man, and I hold him in the highest regard. At no time was I aware of or knowingly took part in an effort to urge Ukraine to investigate former Vice President Biden.
Republicans kept insisting that the holdup in the funding for Ukraine was perfectly normal.
My colleagues asked about, well, doesn't aid get held up for all kinds of reasons? Ambassador Volker, have you ever seen military aid held up because the president wanted his rival investigated?
No, I have not seen that.
Have you ever seen that, Mr. Williams? Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry.
No, Chairman.
And not a single Republican on the committee was willing to admit that the president finally dropped his hold on the Ukraine aid because the president got caught, because a whistleblower filed a complaint about what the president was doing, and the House of Representatives immediately started to investigate. And only after that did President Trump finally stop blocking the funding for Ukraine.
Now, my Republican colleagues, all they seem to be upset about with this is not that the president sought an investigation of his political rival, not that he withheld a White House meeting and $400 million in aid we all passed on a bipartisan basis to pressure Ukraine to do those investigations. Their objection is he got caught. Their objection is that someone blew the whistle, and they would like this whistleblower identified, and the president wants this whistleblower punished. That's their objection, not that the president engaged in this conduct, but that he got caught. Their defense is, well, he ended up releasing the aid. Yes, after he got caught. That doesn't make this any less odious.
Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman came to this country at age 3, fleeing the oppression of the Soviet Union with his family. He and his 2 brothers have all served in the American military. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman ended his opening statement this morning on a personal note.
I'm grateful to for my father's brave act of hope 40 years ago, and for the privilege of being an American citizen and public servant, where I can live free of fear for mine and my family's safety. Dad, I'm sitting here today in the U.S. Capitol talking to our elected professionals is proof that you made the right decision 40 years ago to leave the Soviet Union and come here to the United States of America in search of a better life for our family. Do not worry. I will be fine for telling the truth. Thank you again for your consideration. I will be happy to answer your questions.
Leading off our discussion tonight, our Ambassador Wendy Sherman, former Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration. She's an MSNBC Global Affairs contributor. Ned Price is a former CIA analyst and a former senior director and spokesperson for the National Security Council in the Obama administration. He is an MSNBC national security contributor. And John Heilman is with us. He's national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He is the editor-in-chief of the recount. And John, I just want to go to you to begin with your overview of the day of hearings.
A long day, for sure, but also a powerful day. I think there's been, in terms of these are public hearings, they're aimed at public persuasion, and the human drama around Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was I think, the most striking, maybe the most striking of the public witnesses in this period so far. And I think that you can't help but be struck by the fact that the evidence continues to pile up in a clear and consistent way, telling the same story over and over again, as you see Volker walking back parts of his prior testimony to now concur with the unanimity of the other witnesses on things like there being an explicit quid pro quo. And you also see in the second half of the day, the witnesses the Republicans wanted to have up there doing Donald Trump more damage than good.
And Ned Price, so much of this goes right into your area of expertise, National Security Council procedures. I just want to give you a wide open field for about all of the testimony you heard today, looked at through your expert prism.
You know, I think it was a really stark contrast between this morning's hearing and the afternoon's hearing. This morning hearing, you heard from 2 patriots, people who have eschewed politics for much of their careers, who have their positions not because they were loyal to a president or loyal to a party, but because they worked their way up and through talent and determination and grit have both established themselves in the White House, in the case of Lieutenant Colonel Vindman in the West Wing, in the case of the other, in the office of the vice president. This afternoon, you saw a different story. And I think you saw 2 men who, to use Kurt Volker's term, were still trying to thread a needle. And when Kurt Volker used that term, he sort of described that as the challenge he had to satisfy President Trump, but also to do what was in the national interest of the United States. But it seems like he's still doing that. And along with Tim Morrison, it's not that they're still trying to satisfy President Trump and still trying to represent the United States. Neither of them are still in government. What they're trying to do now is salvage their credibility without perjuring themselves. And they've made that very difficult. And I think you saw this on the part of Kurt Volker today when he made some comments that really strained credulity, claiming that he didn't understand the connection between the Bidens and Burisma, for example, something that Tim Morrison testified that he Googled within 10 days of taking his position, and it was clear as day. On Tim Morrison's part, you heard him say that he didn't find the call on July 25th inappropriate, and yet he went right to the lawyers. And it's these things that really don't square and that I think paint a really unflattering portrait of individuals like these who are in polite society in D.C. and want to stay there regardless of the cost.
Wendy Sherman, with your range of expertise, expertise. I want to give you that same opening to review whatever it is that strikes you the most in today's hearings.
Well, certainly everyone was moved by Lieutenant Colonel Vindman really invoking his father, invoking that we do right here, as he said in his testimony. And it was really quite scurrilous that while he was testifying, using the White House Twitter account, the White House is tweeting out vicious things about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. He's now under protection of the U.S. Army, he and his family. That's really outrageous in this day and age. They're treating him as if he is a disloyal American when he is, in fact, a true patriot. They talked about whether, in fact, by being offered to be the defense minister for Ukraine, he was disloyal to America. I'd remind your viewers that Madeleine Albright, when she was Secretary of State, afterwards was urged by the Czech Republic, her native land, though she has been an American for a very, very long time now, to become president. And she, like Vindman, thought it was quite amusing. And I don't think Republicans believe that Madeleine Albright is disloyal to America, and neither is Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. The other thing in terms of this afternoon that I really want people to understand is the Republicans keep saying that Zelensky never said that he was under pressure. Of course he didn't. He needs the United States. He needs Donald Trump, no matter how awful the president is, now, no matter how corrupt or how much of a bribe this is. And if he admitted he was under pressure, he weakens himself as a president. So we're never going to hear him say that he was pressured. It is a misunderstanding of the bargain that leaders around the world feel they have to make with this president because they have their national interests at stake, even if our president does not have our national interest in his mind.
Let's listen to what Colonel Vindman said in his opening statement about some of the other witnesses who've come forward.
I want to take a moment to recognize the courage of my colleagues who have appeared and are scheduled to appear before this committee. I want to state that the character attacks on these distinguished and honorable public servants is reprehensible. It is natural to disagree and engage in spirited debate, and this has been the custom of our country since the time of our founding fathers. But we are better than personal attacks.
And John Heilemann, the personal attack was coming to him from the White House Twitter account while he was testifying.
Indeed. And, you know, I mean, at this point, unsurprisingly, given the way the president behaved last Friday, even though the attacks that he engaged in on Ambassador Yovanovitch were seen widely as backfiring, as undercutting the Republican cause, made Republican congressmen as vicious and vitriolic as they've been, made them uncomfortable, recognized their strategy was being undercut by the president. And yet here we come around again 2 days later and the same attacks being launched against Lieutenant Colonel Vindman. I just don't think we should expect anything other than that now. But this is going to be it's an appalling state of affairs that this has become conventional. But the president, has no shame when it comes to who he determines to be his targets. And I just think we should assume, for as long as this process plays out, that if the president can attack Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, a men with a Purple Heart, he can attack anyone, and he will.
And Ned, and this can be said about all of the witnesses today, no matter what you think of their particular credibility points that you might want to challenge it. They all have stepped up where John Bolton has refused. I mean, when you look at Tim Morrison, he's in exactly the same status. I mean, precisely the same status as John Bolton. He no longer works in the government, no longer works in the White House. He had a job right under Bolton's jurisdiction, and there he is in the witness chair. There he is. He's not sitting there with his $2 million book deal in New York the way John Bolton is.
John Bolton, what you alluded to, has stepped up in a couple ways. He gave a talk before Morgan Stanley in recent weeks, presumably highly paid. And we also understand that during that talk, he talked about President Trump's affinity for the Turks, not because he favors U.S. foreign policy towards Turkey. He thinks we need closer ties, but because he looks to Turkey as a lucrative market. And this is precisely what we're talking about in this Ukraine scandal. It's President Trump consistently placing his own personal and political interests ahead of the national interest. John Bolton was willing to chat about that to Morgan Stanley in the context of Turkey. It is surprising and it is shameful that he's not willing to talk about that to the United States Congress. I think the other point, Lawrence, and I think it became clear today why Republicans are turning to these attacks, these shameful attacks of dual loyalty and latching on to ancillary issues, you have to remember that the witnesses today, Tim Morrison being one of them, these were minority witnesses.
Yeah, just to make it clear to the audience, the two witnesses called in the afternoon were called by the Republicans. They were Republican witnesses.
They were supposed to present the best case that Republicans have against this impeachment. And just look what we learned. Tim Morrison made very clear that he raised concerns with the lawyers 3 times during this period. He made very clear that it was Donald Trump himself who put a hold on this security assistance for Ukraine. He confirmed his understanding that Gordon Sondland made the extortive scheme very clear to the Ukrainians. And Kurt Volker, for his part, praised Vice President Biden and Marie Yovanovitch. And these are the people who are supposed to make the case against impeachment. They've made the case against Trump and these outlandish conspiracy theories.
Ambassador Sherman, what do you make of Ambassador Volker's testimony today and what he admits to being willing to do, which is to say, actually write the words that he wanted the president of Ukraine to say into the microphone, as Donald Trump wanted him to do, specifying the investigation of Burisma, specifying investigation of 2016 election. Kurt Volker admitted to being willing to go pretty far with what Rudy Giuliani was demanding.
It's quite extraordinary. I've known Kurt Volker for a very long time. I've admired him. I talked to him when he got this position, thought it was a good thing. But quite frankly, I was terribly disappointed today. He was not only threading a needle, he was splitting hairs right and left all along the way. And indeed, he helped to draft a statement for Zelensky while at the same time telling the members incredulously that he really never made the connection between Burisma and Biden. So what was he doing? He said he was really helping to make a statement that was anti-corruption, when in fact the only corruption that was going on here was by the President of the United States. And as others have pointed out today, and certainly pointed out in the hearing today, the president has not gone after corruption in Turkey. He has not gone after corruption in Russia. Heaven only knows he hasn't gone against corruption and murder in Saudi Arabia. He hasn't gone against corruption with his bromance with Kim Jong-un. So the president got a long way to go and wouldn't even include corruption in his phone script that had been prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and the NSC staff.
And Ambassador Volker testified today under oath that he had breakfast with Rudy Giuliani at the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. to talk about what Rudy Giuliani wanted from Ukraine. And Ambassador Volker wants us to believe that the word Biden never came up, that Rudy Giuliani got through the entire breakfast and never said the word Biden. That is a very difficult strain on credibility. We're going to have to take a break here. Wendy Sherman, Ned Price, John Heilemann, thank you all for starting us off tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.